Good evening, and welcome to the third event in this year's annual Holocaust Memorial Week. My name is Kara Ritzheimer. I'm an associate professor in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion at Oregon State University, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Jennifer Evans. Dr. Evans is a professor of German and European history at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, where she teaches transnational histories on a wide range of complex and fascinating topics, including love, hate, sexuality, and everyday life. She also teaches classes that examine the historical development of authoritarianism, fascism, and populism. And I would add that she's currently guiding an impressive number of PhD and master's students. Dr. Evans' research record is as diverse and impressive as her teaching portfolio. Her first book, titled Life Among the Ruins, Cityscape and Sexuality in Cold War Berlin, published in 2011, is a cultural history of Berlin's rebirth in the aftermath of World War II. The book examines key sites of reconstruction, such as streets and train stations, as it grapples with weighty topics such as architecture, geography, and sexuality. Over the last 10 years, Dr. Evans has co-authored or co-edited 4 books, served as editor of 2 special journal editions, and published, by my count, 18 articles and book chapters. These texts all deal with important and complex issues, including gender and masculinity in numerous historical moments in German history, photography and the optics of desire, the Holocaust, and queer theory. Her work has appeared in the American Historical Review, German History, the Journal of History of Sexuality, and Social History. I would add that I sometimes use her scholarship in my own courses, especially with graduate students. Her work is innovative and forward-looking, and Dr. Evans has clearly been at the forefront of several topics that have grown into larger fields, including male sexuality, masculinity, and queer theory. It's no wonder that several students want to work with her. Dr. Evans is also adept at seeing connections between the past and the present, and using her knowledge of the past to analyze and dissect contemporary developments. This quality is clearly evident in one of her current research projects. In 2020, she was awarded a prestigious fellowship from the Social Science Research Council for a project titled Historical Analogy, COVID-19 and the 2020 US Election, How Historical Misinformation Undermines Democratic Institutions. Professor Evans is currently working on a monograph that focuses on the intersection of social media and Holocaust memory, and told me today that she's very close to completing a first draft of another book, tentatively titled Queer Life After Fascism. And I'm not even mentioning the text tonight that she's also shepherding through the publishing process as the co-editor. She is certainly a force for research and publishing. In recent years, Dr. Evans has also become a pioneer in taking history into the public realm. In 2016, she collaborated with Dr. Elizabeth Heinemann to create and launch a website called the New Fascism Syllabus. This is a valuable resource and online meeting place for scholars and individuals interested in German history, the Holocaust, and fascism, not just as historical topics, but also as contemporary issues. She's also an avid blogger on these topics. In her talk tonight, titled Social Media and the Long Shadow of the Holocaust, Dr. Evans will explore how platforms like Facebook are used to discuss the Holocaust, sometimes to minimize or even deny it, but often to spread knowledge of it and of the lessons that are implicit in it. Before I turn things over, I would just like to clarify that Dr. Evans will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for questions afterward. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. The questions won't be publicly visible, but I'll be able to see them and she'll be able to see them, and then I will collect these questions and pose them to her. And with that, I would now like to pass things on to Dr. Evans, who again is joining us from Ottawa, Canada, where it is now, I would like to add, a little after 10 p.m.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kara. I'm going to share the screen just to get things all set up and make sure everything is working. And indeed, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I have to say, I know that I've hated COVID, much like all of us, and yet I really appreciate these opportunities to listen in on talks. It's made a lot of it very bearable. So thank you, everyone, for joining tonight, and thanks for the introduction. I'm speaking to you this evening from the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, acknowledging the land and Indigenous peoples still caught in the struggle against white supremacy in my city, Ottawa, and in the country now known as Canada, is an essential part of any conversation, I think, but most especially one like ours today, which explores the long shadow and continued reverberations of race thinking, white supremacy, and genocide, and the different ways it continues to mark our lives as settlers and as citizens. In the time I have with you tonight, I want to talk with you about my research with social media and what it does to shape what we call post-Holocaust memory. And that's how we understand the Holocaust several generations removed from the actual events. As Kara mentioned, I'm an historian who wears many different hats. A large part of my work draws on photography and visual culture to analyze how the meaning of images moves and changes along its journey, say from a personal photo to a photo album or a gallery space. I've made entire arguments around the role of a single photograph in creating new ways to think about history, about identity, about subjectivity. I'm in the final stages of a book on social media and Holocaust memory. And I've also started, as you heard, on a multi-year big data project on historical analogy and the US election, part of a larger project on populism and memory in the North American mediascape. In my work, I'm very interested in the distinctions between media forms and what different media do to shape how we think of and make sense of the past. So let's take something like photography, just as an example, because I'm going to talk a little bit about photos tonight. A photograph's meaning is presumed to be straightforward and transparent. It documents an event, it freezes a moment in time, and it captures an action or a sentiment. But what a photo actually means is not self-evident. Photography theorist, let's make sure we get this. Hello. Yeah. Photography theorist Susan Sontag explored this in her 2003 book Regarding the Pain of Others, with the example of Virginia Woolf in Three Guineas. In the story, set in 1924, just 5 years following the calamity of World War I, Woolf describes a conversation with a lawyer about explicit war photos, graphic depictions of civilians, of lives completely destroyed. Her protagonist asks whether these images show that war is bad and must be stopped at all costs. Sontag uses this example to describe how images so disturbing and so graphic in one person's telling are pacifistic or anti-war. But another person's view might just be that they justify war, that we need these kinds of images to prevent further violence. So photography's meaning, in other words, is never singular. But while images are tricky, we can all agree there is surely something powerful in their ability to bring emotion, suffering, and injustice to the light of day, as we all witnessed this last summer with the horrific images and video of George Floyd's killing. The meaning of images is not inherent or straightforward, but they hold tremendous emotion and immense power. The same might be said for the images and texts that circulate in social media. But if photographs are complex windows into human action, social media creates different challenges. Just as photography is seen as having a democratizing impulse, it's a mass practice. Everyone can be an artist or a documentarian and speak truth to power. So too does social media offer that same affordance. It gives platforms to different voices for better and often for worse. It creates a more diversified, maybe even a fractured public sphere, and it creates alternative sources of authority and expertise. Now, none of what I'm saying really comes as a surprise. I know in the past several years, we've become extremely conversant with this world of technologically mediated living, whether it's Zoom seders, weddings, or birthdays, or everyday talk of algorithms, AI, deepfakes, dis and misinformation, platform regulation, and memes. And yet we actually know very little about how the tech itself works, how it drives and surfaces ideas, and how these circulate and shape in our own social imaginary. I will argue tonight that this is absolutely essential that we take up the challenge and try to make sense of social media's role in how to think about the impact of the Holocaust and the rise or return, one might say, of white supremacy and the new right. So I began these digital projects several years ago by asking one simple question: how can we use social media for good? It certainly can be used for ill. But how might we harness it to better understand historical memory 3/4 of a century after the end of World War II, where report after report shows that anti-Semitism is on the rise globally, that everyday acts of hate seem to be everywhere, and the far right is more emboldened than ever these last decades. In the service of time, I'm going to get straight to my argument. Despite the various methodological challenges in using these documents, social media is a pertinent source for understanding the construction of everyday memories of Nazi crimes in the post-Holocaust age. But it requires a mix of qualitative and quantitative methods to do it well. It is worth the effort. Images shared via hashtag in Flickr or Tumblr, Facebook posts, and the now ubiquitous likes, and yes, even Instagram selfies, sometimes in the most hallowed of spaces, provide windows into how everyday people engage with and make sense of history. People use these sources to better understand their own lives in relation to larger historical events. As Amsterdam media scholar José van Dijk has argued, participatory media, as it's sometimes called, allows people to sharpen their own remembered experiences and the testimonies of others against available public versions, official documents, exhibits, textbooks, films, and so on. These forms of cultural memory are personal acts of commemoration, out of which arises larger collective meditations on past trauma. They arise in dialogue with official histories. They don't supplant them. To demonstrate the usefulness of social media analysis while also touching on its challenges methodologically, I'm going to focus my talk around three things tonight: the official and vernacular Holocaust memory we see developing in a place like Instagram, the use of demographic marketing tools to make sense of Facebook's far right population, and a short snapshot of large-scale data analysis of the Capitol insurrection this last January. My point is that however fraught, and believe me, it is vexing and difficult working with sources like these, they are invaluable windows into everyday acts of remembrance, rooted sometimes in empathy and also in hatred. This is vital information if we are to meet the challenges of the days and years ahead. So why is it so difficult to work with social media? One problem is that what science and technology scholar Bruno Latour has called technology's black box effect. That is, that the ubiquitousness of the technology masks its complexity. We all use Facebook, or many of us use Facebook, Instagram, some of us use TikTok and Twitter, so we believe we implicitly understand how it works, how it enables conversation and makes meaning. But believe me, as a fellow of the SSRC, working with other data scientists and humanists, I can tell you that we are actually quite far from the meat and potatoes of how the technology functions, beyond echo chambers and algorithmic enclaves, how images move from platform to platform, or how to track and code and analyze the different sources, and how to think about authority, what sticks and what doesn't. It's a little bit like the Wild West. Speaking as an historian, we are unused to the kinds of renegade archives that this technology creates. These archives are fleeting. In working with Facebook, as an example, you can't click backwards any further back than 6 months. It won't allow you to look back into previous conversations beyond 6 months. So if you want to capture an idea or an image or a moment in time, you almost have to imagine what's going to be relevant going forward and screen capture day after day after day's worth of conversations, creating an archive in a very different way than historians are used to working with. Then there's the sheer size of some of these archives. Some of my own data sets from the Capitol insurrection alone comprise 100,000 tweets, with almost a million stored in my online repository. Still, it bears asking, how might we use this material to better understand how everyday people make sense of the legacies of the Holocaust and the lessons of the past? Well, the internet is not like a monument. It isn't what French memory scholar Pierre Nora called a lieu de mémoire, a site of memory. It is forever shifting and it is boundless. The memory formations it helps create are not just traveling, but as digital media scholar Andrew Hoskins has argued, they are literally changing on the fly. My argument is that if we truly want to understand the role of Web 2.0 in this post-Holocaust age, what distinct social media platforms do for better and for worse, we have to think more capaciously about what and how we practice history. And that includes working across disciplines and in collaboration with others, other scholars, and everyday citizens. Because like it or not, social media has become a place where memories of the Holocaust take shape through user-driven content shared in elaborately interconnected communication networks. Alongside curated exhibits, documentaries, and scholarly research, smartphone photos, short videos, online texts shape and reflect popular consciousness. They document how everyday people make sense of the crime and after effects of genocide and create the conditions for how they put that knowledge to use. And yet, there is more to them still. As part of digital communication networks, these practices of commemoration and self-understanding are delimited by the very technologies that undergird them. They're mediated texts. They are proprietary texts owned by the platform and not the user. So if Instagram were to fold tomorrow, all of the images that I have yet to capture are gone with it. So that's a huge and important distinction between social media archives and the traditional archive. When these texts are shared and trafficked, they become remediated texts, hybridized mixes of self and other, present and past, pushed through the ebbs and flows of the network. And finally, these platforms themselves are all very different. Each one has their own rules and workings, what we call affordances, that shape what is sayable, what data might accompany a post, and how privacy and community standards work to regulate what is said and to whom. So I'm basically almost making a case not to use social media, but as you'll see, there are some rewards for using it mindfully. As complex and as difficult it is to navigate, galleries, museums, and research libraries have taken up the challenge of meeting their audience where it resides online. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Library of Congress, and even the New York Public Library all have Tumblr accounts and a presence on Instagram. They have dedicated media strategies and comms folks thinking about interactions with the public and how that shapes historical memory. Both the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem World Holocaust Remembrance Center rely on several social media accounts to communicate programming, special events, educational initiatives, to promote important dates and ceremonies, and showcase the architecture and exhibit halls. They make use of their own hashtags, hashtag USHMM and hashtag Yad Vashem, to ensure that all museum correspondence is easy to locate in the digital media sphere. And they actively solicit museum visitors' participation in sharing their experiences online. The Instagram archive of the Holocaust, connected through hashtags, is vast. It is a visual archive, but also an archive of visitor response, of experience, of emotion and interpretation, serving to provide the viewer or the wider Instagram public and the museums and memorial sites with a rich compendium of feedback and visitor engagement. This archive is participatory, meaning it actively seeks out audience engagement, and the responsibility of building an online digital and visual presence is shared with individual content creators who help to move and remediate the Holocaust and its memory in new digital spaces. We can see this in the Auschwitz Memorial's requests that their visitors perform as both witnesses and messengers. And you can see, I'm gonna read out this section right here where my cursor is. It's said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. However, we ask you to share your pictures and others and tell them about your experience of the visit. By taking and sharing pictures, you become messengers who should tell others about the history of the German Nazi concentration and extermination camp and its victims. And then the hashtags underneath, which you can't see, hashtag Auschwitz Memorial, hashtag Auschwitz, hashtag photography, memory, and hashtag Instagram. So the Auschwitz Memorial's caption demonstrates that photography, hashtags, and instant photo sharing serve as an important indicator of presence, of memory, and of education. While they are urged to share their images with proper hashtags and all, the museum does not request that the content creator ignore their own deeply personal interpretation of the site. Indeed, it plays a central role in how Holocaust memory is to be communicated to others as part of the message of remembrance. Many followers will never be able to physically visit Auschwitz for many reasons. But the construction of a digitized sense of Holocaust space and place on Instagram collapses this distance, allowing publics far and wide to at least engage with Auschwitz, its visuality through their browsers or smartphones. As one post from the Auschwitz Memorial stated, "To like is to remember." The larger caption here from the museum to its viewers and visitors actually reads, "Thank you for creating our virtual community of remembrance. Thank you for showing us that photography can also be used to commemorate the tragic history of Auschwitz." The value of Instagram to the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum and to global Holocaust memory is not unnoticed or underappreciated by the museum's colleagues and its followers. The Neuengamme concentration camp memorial, Instagram user at neuengamme.memorial, praises the Auschwitz Memorial. "Thank you for commemorating and remembering, also in social media. Thank you for going on and telling stories and helping not to forget." Instagram user at Lord William, his name's odd, Lord William Oftabunet, expresses their thanks for, quote, "helping us not to forget and allowing those that aren't able to experience it in person the opportunity to see it in such detail." It's clear from how this museum views user photography circulated in Instagram. It's clear that this is important. But what about how everyday people use social media to curate their own encounters with the crimes of the Third Reich? Instead of simply recognizing the usefulness of social media as spaces where institutions make and share history from the top down, what happens when we look at social media sources and their producers and consumers as co-curators of historical memory, as involved in a complex negotiation of how the Holocaust should be pictured and understood? In the book I'm writing with Megan Lundergan, Holocaust Memory in the Digital Mediascape, we argue that social media documents are digitized encounters that both reflect and construct emotional or affective relationships between the self, the past, and one's audience, creating what might variously be understood as connective memory. Images circulating in social media act as prisms through which we might evaluate how a person relates to historical events. In 2004 and later again in 2014, feminist anti-racist thinker Sarah Ahmed suggested thinking about this as an affective economy. An affective economy is something in which emotions do things. They align individuals with communities or bodily space with social space through the very intensity of their attachments. Rather than seeing emotions as psychological dispositions, we need to consider how they work in concrete and particular ways to mediate the relationship between the psychic and the social, and between the individual and the collective. Emotions work by sticking figures together, which creates the very effect of a collective and coherence. To be affected by something such that we move toward or away from that thing is an orientation towards something. It's in the intensity of bodily responses to worlds that we make judgments about those worlds. And those judgments are directive, even if they do not follow narrative rules of sequence of cause and effect. Social media texts propelled through networks and online archives produce modes of visibility, shaping how violence becomes imaginable and understandable. But not all bodies or issues or emotions garner the same degree of visibility. And so we have to think mindfully about when and where certain emotions stick. In other words, we have to read social media texts as cultural texts, as sources requiring qualitative analysis that take seriously things like violence, cadence, irony, emotion, and in the case of photographs, image constitution as well as circulation. The relationship between maker and audience, and critically, how the source's purposefulness and authority is produced and sustained by the network and the medium itself. The fact that social media is tricky does not nullify its usefulness as a source, but it does mean we have to tread mindfully. So maybe let's look at a few examples to see what I mean. So this is taken from Instagram, and it's an 11-year-old girl in 2015 in Berlin. And we see in these two images how this girl engages with Berlin's Homo Monument on the right and the Eisenman Memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe on the left. In the two images, you see how the subject responds to the monument's call for a highly aestheticized experience. She stages her own sorrow at learning about these groups and their suffering, and she does this pictorially, using light and shadow to convey the mood. She's also deeply aware of her audience and displays a sense of solemnity, disciplining her own body's movement in a space like this. And maybe she was also trying to earn a little bit of her mother's praise, just a little bit as well. Although this might be missing from most people's analysis, this is in fact my now 17-year-old daughter, Jillian, and I'm the one actually taking the pictures. In instances like this, it's rare to know the identity and motivations behind an image. A photograph like this, though, becomes socially important to the curation of online identity through the way it lends visibility to the individual and their experiences, reminding the digital publics that I was here and it was meaningful. When connected to other images via hashtag, it becomes part of an effective economy or archive of remembrance. But it also stakes a moment in time in contemporary memory culture. And in this case, in 2015, when the photo was taken, a child mourned for queer victims, a hard-fought gain in the history of remembering the persecution of homosexuals, whose suffering was disregarded for so long. In other words, a simple Instagram photograph like this one marks an important shift in memory culture more broadly. The image functions on several layers of performance. The taking of the photo as a staged physical construction is the first layer, with the networking of the image acting as a second mode of performance, embedded within the social mediascape. It becomes what some have called as an example of integrative propaganda with its own feeling rules. That is a series of rituals and enactments that have their purpose to build harmony, order, connection, peace, and remembering. But it also reveals the long and fraught history of homophobia and exclusion that marked queer victims of the Third Reich. And this is an image from a different woman at the memorial, again, for the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. Images acquire emotional power through the use of filters to convey a sense of artfulness, as in the slide here, which uses color saturation to affect a mood. Here, the Berlin Memorial tends to have this effect on tourists, serving as an art piece in its own right. Although many people think of the stone stele as a grave, the architect wanted it to be a living space, open to interaction and interpretation. It is also common to use a kind of black and white filter for photos in Instagram with a splash of red, a la Schindler's List, indicating the importance of other forms of media, in this case film, in shaping how personal memory takes form. How the Holocaust should be pictured has deep roots. The public's understanding of what the Holocaust should look like is a learned pattern of behavior, which is drawn from public news coverage of the Holocaust, museums, popular film, and mediatized visual typologies. Of course, many of the early images of the camps were black and white images taken by the US Army Signal Corps or photojournalists for Time and Life magazine. When a tourist chooses a black and white filter, it conveys a performed sense of historical authority. These images can be read as an exertion of the photographer's understanding of historicism, or maybe a wish that the horrible events of the Holocaust remain in the past, grainy and dated. The black and white filter is also an attempt to void the landscape of any color, symbolizing loss, death, and horror, completely within our stylistic and cultural understandings of Shoah representation. Tourist images also show the degree to which people view certain objects, items, and landmarks as iconic, the Tower of Faces at the USHMM, the Auschwitz train tracks or gate. But they also reveal alternative markers of memory, a photo of a person's feet in the gallery space with reflective commentaries, and even a selfie. These generate memory, some officially sanctioned or recognizable, and others more renegade. As sources, they are filled with affective resonance that allows us to reflect on the political uses of emotion around who can remember the Holocaust and in what way. Filters also help the user deepen their own connections to the place of memory. This is not to say that Instagram photographers do not struggle with traditional notions of beauty when confronted with Auschwitz's sense of place. Instagram user at Legally Abroad explains in their caption of a photograph of the gates of Auschwitz, not all places in this world are meant to show beauty. Though the sunrise is bright and beautiful here, this place reminds us of the horrible darker that you could ever possibly imagine. Auschwitz Memorial corroborates this sentiment in a 2019 image of a bird on the gates, which you see here. The caption reads, "Sometimes people say that hashtag birds never fly over Auschwitz. They do fly. They do not understand the meaning of this place. We understand it as the history of Auschwitz is a human story, the story of horrible human suffering and pain, and the story of human hatred." While beauty is fraught, so too are expressions of joy. One thinks of the infamous Auschwitz selfie, which was widely condemned several years ago. But the image of a girl smiling in a photo on this site was in every way an effort to connect, it turns out, with her dead father's lifelong dream of traveling to the site with his daughter, because they both shared this desire to know more. Selfie taking poses the greatest challenge to our sensibilities around how to move in a respectful way through these spaces. Recalling again, though, the quote from Susan Sontag at the beginning of my talk, photographic meaning is not obvious or singular. As Günter Morsch, the 25-year former director of the Sachsenhausen Memorial Museum, put it, selfies are a part of today's cultural experience and the virtualization of the world. In the virtual world, people try to integrate an authentic place into part of their own image. And that's exactly something positive. We might bristle at how they choose to do so, but what we are doing in effect is generating engagement, creating discourse, showing how messy and difficult these memories are and the history behind them. In an era of polarization, it is of keeping the memory and history alive, showing how it is relevant to today. As the spokesperson for the Berlin Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, Felicitas Borzim, puts it, "It is important that this be an open place and that visitors experience it for themselves and see what they want to do in this space and what it does to them. If someone is doing a pose a little too much in the direction of too flashy, employees might mention to the person, and this is perhaps not the right place for it to be happening, given what the memorial represents. But this type of dialogue," she says, "is effective." More problematic is the use of shame. The Holocaust Project is the best example which saw Israeli artist Shahak Shapira cull photographs from Instagram without consent and then place them into frames with Holocaust images, themselves decontextualized and from very different sites. More instructive was the way the Auschwitz Memorial Museum chose to navigate the now infamous duck selfie by opening up dialogue and promoting introspection. The Instagram moderator actually engaged in a conversation with the creator of the image, who ultimately apologized for his photograph, not realizing at first how problematic it was. As these examples show, Instagram opens up a space to think about a host of issues around how to mark and commemorate mass violence, how to move through these spaces, how to capture and communicate that experience for one's peers, and how we might think about the role and potential of these images. They serve as visual evidence of a performed presentness, an engagement with the history of the Holocaust, steeped in affect. This might be on the site itself or far from the place of remembrance as a part of a larger virtual archive. They illustrate both tensions and collaboration between the hegemonic museological components of the space and the visitor experience. They contribute to and sometimes complicate a standard singular visual historical Holocaust narrative. And they respatialize the Holocaust by removing it from the actual sites of remembrance and bringing it to new places of consumption, the personal computer, the home office, the cafe, or maybe the school. Like memory scholar James Young argues, memory is not forged in a vacuum. And here we maybe see it might be conjured in a whole host of other spaces, opening up interesting opportunities for thinking about how we reach people with these stories. And they also discipline the tourist and the viewer in unique ways around how one should act and be in places of remembrance, not always in productive ways. My PhD student and collaborator on this book, Megan Lundrigan, was prohibited from taking photos at the USHMM, even though the museum allowed it, and it was part of her project and it was authorized as okay to document the way people engaged with the space. This raises a bunch of questions for scholars about when and where and how education happens, and in what visual, aesthetic, and museological register. So we might ask, how does the creation of these personalized, subjective views of the past, personalized versions of the past even, affect the possibility for a unified or unifying collective memory? This speaks to the issue of authority over the past, a thorny issue when the stakes are high, as with this subject that we all study. But authority must not be confused with truth. What we are dealing with, of course, is representation. But how might we know when certain sources stick more than others, when they have a greater impact or influence? Authority in this case is something that manifests through the sources themselves, through stylization, how often certain poses, certain filters, certain framing devices surface as an example, but also through remediation. That is the frequency with which certain texts and images are circulated and recirculated and also liked. So something like Elie Wiesel's famous photograph often pops up in personal blogs and YouTube video vignettes, suggesting it carries a kind of gravitas that other archival sources do not. But there's another way to get at impact, and this is through digital humanities tools and network analysis. So let me give you a few examples of how we might do that. So what I've just done here is analyze these images as texts somewhat removed from the networks within which they travel and coalesce. So turning away from Holocaust imagery, I want to look in the last two examples at white supremacy and the contemporary struggles with the far right. I'm going to show you two tangible examples of how we can work with social media with a mix of qualitative and quantitative methods for what it reveals. By now, we all know that Facebook is deeply implicated in the mess we find ourselves in today. Scores of examples, are circulating. Most relevant, the inadequate community standards protocols allowing hate to circulate online, its lack of accountability and real oversight. Most recently, their self-appointed oversight committee weighed in on a complicated matter of hate speech and freedom of expression in troubling ways. Of course, the issue of privacy and access to our own data is of primary concern. Indeed, the site's group and messaging privacy features are what make Facebook a prime space for nefarious organizations beyond the reach of scholars and law enforcement itself. And algorithms and marketing. Who hasn't wondered how it is that when they search for something on Amazon, it turns up in their Facebook feed? As part of my book on social media and post-Holocaust memory, we looked at how the same software used to monetize Facebook can actually help us better understand the makeup of the far right itself. The ethical challenge is this: the more we clamp down on the social media giant, the harder it is to access this material, and the further we are pushed away from the data we need to understand the role of media and memory, denial, and the radical right. Let's look at some examples. It might surprise you to learn that successive changes in privacy settings have actually made Facebook one of the hardest platforms to use for research. This shifting terrain has meant scholars have had to rely on creative methodological strategies to gain access to data. Facebook, like I said, has no archive. Researchers have to rely on screen captures collected in real time. There are several application programming interfaces or APIs, software to software interfaces that Facebook itself has made accessible for third-party developers and marketers to access user information. And indeed, computer scientist Megan Squires at Elon University has done excellent work with this, charting out the participation of women in hate groups. But while she was able to use Facebook's API and gather and analyze over 700,000 members of 1,870 Facebook groups, spanning 10 different far-right ideologies between June 2017 and March 2018, changes to Facebook's privacy policy made that kind of research impossible just a few years later. So the much needed privacy issues have led to it being harder for researchers to have access to the data we need to better understand the far right. We're in this little vicious circle. There are other ways in which researchers can gain access to user preferences. One is to place a survey in a particular group page, which the UK think tank Demos has done in many of their studies. One could also go dark and apply for inclusion in a group, but this poses ethics challenge concerns for most university and grant council review boards, not to mention it's not really very pleasant work. Short of acquiring access from Facebook directly, which so far has not happened, one of the only options available to us beyond screenshots is to use existing marketing programs to generate demographic information, which I sometimes call as MacGyvering one of their marketing tools. And I'm going to show you how I've used it in my own work. So through its own marketing software called Audience Insights, Facebook culls user information for demographic data, including information about income, education, entertainment and lifestyle, job titles, family size, age, and political persuasion. This tool, still at the center of privacy debates, and in fact, it's going to be removed from the market in another month, is nevertheless of tremendous help in piecing together one of the most elusive aspects of historical research: who is actually consuming and reproducing online content. Audience Insights is based around self-identifiers. So those subscribing to far-right ideas, they identify this way in their user preferences in Facebook. Historians can mine this data for city, state, and country-specific information, including the size of a given network. So you see here, this is from Germany. This network claims it's 150 to 200,000 people active in this who identify as far-right per month. This program shows everything from the device used to connect to Facebook, the percentage of desktop versus smartphone users, and it also gives us demographic information from gender, age, and page likes and frequency of use, including what people consume and the organizations they support. And this is an interesting, an interesting set of graphs, because what it shows us, taken in March 2018, is that of this particular network, we see 13% of women users in the age of 15 to 64, And when we look at men, we're seeing a fairly significant difference in terms of participation. So it provides essential data that kind of works against some of our stereotypes. If we focus in on one group in particular that was identified in this German data set, and this is from Germany, it's a group called 1% for Deutschland, 1% for Germany. We're able to find out key information about this organization. So this organization puts itself out in the world as though it's just another citizens initiative. And the name comes from the idea that just 1% of the German population, if it were to voice its opposition to contemporary policies, we'd see a sea change in how politicians are forced to react to certain issues, immigration and refugee policy especially. This group has blocked APIs from tracking groups that they are associated with on Facebook. But if we go through Twitter instead, we're able to see things like this. Now it's going to be all graph-like in a second, but I'm going to explain what you see. So don't get afraid of the graphs. So if we go through Twitter and we look at the posts that are generated through this particular group's Twitter handle, and this is data that was collected through a publicly accessible marketing program called NetViz that gathers information about what is posted online, what is reposted, liked, and what issues are commented on. It can show us important and interesting things. Here we see examples from 1% for Deutschland's claims to being it claims to being a slick, modern, reasonable citizens initiative for free opposition to the immigration problem. But in actuality, their supporters and their posts clearly take a keener than usual interest in stories within the far right orbit. We see in these peaks certain specific moments in the news, in the news calendar in Germany. So one of the first peaks is the co-chairperson Frauke Petri preparing to step down in March 2017. The second peak is Bjorn Höcke's comments on the embarrassment of the Berlin Holocaust Memorial, and Höcke has now been we are now allowed to call Höcke a fascist because many of his speeches and his touchstones have echoed and in some cases even used sort of fascist language in them. In the June 22nd, 2017 peak, we see the German parliament's vote to exclude federal money from the NPD, the far-right party, citing them as fascist. And if we look at this peak, the one peak here on this slide, this is the Chemnitz race riots from 2018, which followed a high-profile stabbing during a folk festival that turned into a targeting of racialized Germans and minorities. Now, we can't get into the actual pages, the Facebook pages, to see what the discussion looks like. It doesn't work that way. So we have to actually go through newspapers to try to identify what these specific peaks and valleys are. What it all shows us is that despite their public face of being just another citizens initiative with no connections to neo-Nazis or the fascist past, their own Facebook and Twitter users and the data stream reveals what the anti-racist organization, the Amadou and Antonio Stiftung, has argued all along, that 1% is a conduit between the new right and the extreme right neo-Nazi scene. They also had connections to the Austrian identity movement that turned up on the radar of the New Zealand shooter. So you can see social media pulled apart with different tools can tell us a lot about these groups and their attitudes. Let me just give you one more point before we hear some of your questions. If we want to take the temperature of a single event, there are other ways we might use social media analysis to our advantage. What you see here is one screen capture of a very small part of a large data set of Twitter data that I harvested, or that my research assistant, who's amazing, Brendan Regato, harvested from the Capitol insurrection this past January. And this is one single hashtag, Trump coup, which we tracked from before the Capitol insurrection to January 25th, and we're still tracking the data to this day with a program called Tags. What you see here, or what you could see if you were looking at the entire Excel sheet, is 74,000 tweets of tabular data, which includes timestamps, primary and secondary and tertiary hashtags, ID, any attached photos, and hyperlinks. And that's just one hashtag. We have harvested over 1 million individual tweets from all the different hashtags we followed. So what can you do with this? Well, we can clean it. We can clean the data and run it through software called Tableau to visualize patterns like this one. This graph shows secondary hashtags according to the original tweet, um, retweet, and mentions. So we get a sense of how people are capturing and characterizing what they saw unfolding. We can map out a time signature to think about spikes in the data stream when people were most active in tweeting certain things. And when we isolate these peaks, we can do a deeper dive according to date and time to try to figure out what those spikes relate to specifically, like I did in this earlier example. We can get a snapshot of users, of whose voices were making the most impact in the online conversation, factoring in original tweets, retweets, mentions, and the size of their own established audiences. And because we're interested in historical analogy in this project, how many times do people liken events to the history of fascism, communism, to Trump as Hitler, or discussions around Antifa as being this way or that. We did a very preliminary call of the data for certain keywords, which we can then use to narrow down the field and ultimately do a more qualitative analysis, whether using discourse analysis, content analysis, or even visual culture analysis. But as you see, there are still relatively large numbers to work with. So how might we parse it even further? Oh, we apparently don't, according to my screens. We use a whole bunch of different technologies and programs to think about frequency, the reach, the use of certain language, of hashtags, and even of emotions. This would allow us to visualize the affective network dimension of civic engagement, of narratives, of ways that people framed their story in an effort to create what one scholar has called a network structure of feeling. We can look for these visual markers and images. We can look for the use of filters, of font, of humor, of mobility, and network to get at some of the same kinds of questions that we looked at with those photographs in Instagram. We can, in effect, isolate the most popular images from the cacophony of the crowd and track what is being shared and at what most popular times. So it's one thing to see an image circulate in the news and become iconic, like this image of Viking Man, as we'll call him. But our method seeks to see the data itself and the way it makes visible what is often assumed or simply unseen. But with over 1 million tweets in our data repository, or even thousands, once you whittle it down, you can appreciate how hard it is to extrapolate generalizations. We're still witness participants to this event, not to mention we are also operating under multiple traumas, which no doubt shapes what we see. So let me conclude with a few thoughts. Mediated memory objects, such as the texts and images that circulate in social media, are crucial sources for thinking about the relationship between everyday people and culture at large, between personal memories and public knowledge, and between the lay knowledge that develops online and expertise in universities and in the history books. The archives people generate out of their own texts and images are not static. They're rich and dynamic repositories of information, always in flux. They challenge institutional authority over the past, but only if we presume they speak for the totality of cultural memory. And this would be short-sighted. Instead, it's best to view social media memory making as something other than a zero-sum game. It's not a distortion or an enhancement of it. It's part of a cultural process played out by various agents, by individuals, by technologies, by conventions, institutions, and so on. We need to interpret it critically. Individual actions are not wholly separate from the collective. The relationship is mutually reinforcing and reflexive. And our actions are only understandable if we see them as thoroughly mediated through digital connections and also through the social institutions that give them shape. They generate conversation, they refocus our attention on what matters. Sometimes they point indeed to what is immensely dangerous. But ultimately, they show us that people are engaging, thinking, and indeed remembering online as well as off. The risk in denying the importance of these layers of interpretation is the loss of those who might otherwise be made part of the process of education and change. Thank you.
Jen, thank you for just an amazing and fascinating talk. There's so much in what you said tonight, and I have so many questions. And just off the top of my head, a lot of this is transnational. So I wonder about the challenge of doing research across national boundaries where countries also have different rules about social media. But I wanted to take advantage of my privileged position here and maybe ask the first question. And I wanted to get back to your comment about connective memory. And particularly, you also made a comment about this expectation of what the Holocaust should look like, which also kind of reminded me is I think people sometimes have an expectation of what a Holocaust memoir should look like. So sort of, to me, I saw a parallel. But I wondered, how is online or connective memory, as you call it, different from other forms of Holocaust memory scholars have studied?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, the thing that you can't help but notice when you look at social media is that for all that it is different, there's a lot to it that is also the same. I mean, these are images and texts which we all grapple with as historians, and we all know that to read a photograph requires a different sort of toolkit than to read a poster, to read a government document. And so it's the same with the text that circulate in social media. Um, so we have to think very critically about what it is that we're actually seeing. We have to recognize too that we'll call them the analog sources of memory were not always accepted as given as authoritative. So Holocaust historians will be the first to tell anyone that testimony was something that for quite a long time was seen as suspicious. It was subjective. It wasn't something that you could stake claims on because it too was shifting and changing. Photography, I mean, these images, these documented images of the camps and liberation were were taken with the fear that people would not see what was directly in front of them. So they weren't seen as authoritative. They were seen as bolstering the need to empirically support what had happened. So all of the sources, whether analog or digital, require great care and a lot of effort on the part of the historian. What is different about social media is, in fact, the mediated nature of the sources, the swiftness through which the sources move through the networks, and how that changes everything from the relationship to the sources themselves to the constructions of time in those sources. So there are these differences that are quite significant and that require us to push ourselves in all sorts of different directions to be able to make sense of them.
There's, if you have questions, please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. And then we have one question in there. How often are these museum accounts and hashtags targeted by trolling campaigns from sites with open far-right and neo-Nazi groups such as 4chan? So I think, how often are the museum hashtags being repurposed or sort of hijacked by groups on the right?
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, this is an interesting question. I mean, when you actually are looking at these hashtags, I mean, some of them are so ubiquitous, right? Like hashtag Holocaust. If you were to put in hashtag Holocaust into Instagram, you're going to get images from all different places. So they won't even just be specific museum images, right? They will be anything that's been hashtagged that with that term. So you're going to see all sorts of different things, within, your one singular screen. So that requires, a certain sort of attentiveness to what you're seeing there. When it comes to the actual site itself, whether it's the Yad Vashem or the Holocaust Museum, yeah, it's always a thing. And we haven't done the work to actually itemize like percentages about X number of times that they've been trolled. And I'm not even sure that the museums and these sites themselves have that kind of data. It also requires a lot of energy to do that kind of work. So it's not an easy answer. It's not an easy question to answer, but certainly, if we've thought it, it's been done, right? And much in the same way that the educators, the on-site educators in the various camps have had to prepare for an increase. And in fact, this is the case anecdotally, I've heard from some of the German camps in Germany proper, they have witnessed an increase in being confronted by explicit far right intervention on site. So we are living in an age where we're seeing more of it, and it's just about how to quantify that.
Thank you. We have another question. To what extent do you and your research assistants detect the work of bot accounts and disinformation agents in order to amplify hateful and right-wing tweets and social media content? It strikes me as particularly challenging, and this is from the person who posed the question, which is my colleague, Katie Hubler. It strikes me as particularly challenging to track authentic human responses to particular content and news events, given how right-wing groups have adapted to game social media algorithms and boost visibility of misinformation.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a huge part of, a huge part of the process of doing this kind of work is recognizing that it's inherently subjective, right? That it isn't about, and I'm not trying to say that there is the sort of the one way of viewing these things. I think it's one of the reasons why I like to open up with that, that example of photography being something that can be massaged in different directions, that even before, the period that we're living in, these same sorts of concerns around sort of what is the authentic message of visual sources is something we have to be extremely critical of, for sure. But I also think that there is something to be said for teaching sort of visual, cultural, and digital literacy, so that you can learn to see places and spaces where stuff is being manipulated and minimized. And this is one of the reasons why the project that we have on populism, the deliverables, as it were, are a series of modules that will go to classrooms to help teachers teach high school students how to navigate this playing field mindfully, because yeah, the use of a historical sort of set of hues, black and white, it does convey a certain um, legitimacy and expertise that not everybody is maybe able to pick apart in the way that they need to, especially when you think about a place like contemporary Poland right now, where the mainstream institutions are fostering very problematic sort of view on this history. And so the student has to be able to sort of figure out that it's not just about bots, it's also about government policy to sort of skew the way that this history is being presented. So it's complicated indeed.
Very. Another question came up about the platforms. What responsibility would you place on the platforms to combat Holocaust denialism and to amplify accurate information? On TikTok, for example, Jewish creators who talk about the Holocaust are often suppressed, whereas alt-right creators are amplified and let their hateful messages spread so easily.
Yeah, I mean, content moderation is a huge issue, right? We see this in every platform, and I think the challenge is, of course, when social media platforms regulate themselves, and that's what we're seeing, right? And this example that the person raised about sort of how TikTok can sort of work this way or that, the Facebook Oversight Committee's recent stance on the Joseph Goebbels quotation, right? I mean, most most people are recognizing that we're going to need some sort of apparatus that will have teeth and that is taking this beyond the power of the platforms themselves, because there's obviously a vested interest in sort of the status quo. So it's not an easy solution. There are many different proposals out there for how to go about content mediation, whether it's citizen councils, whether there might be some sort of multilateral approach to it. It's tricky because of the different, like Kara said at the outset, the different laws regulating hate. Germany has very strong laws about what can be countenanced in public, and that's very different than in the US and in Canada to some degree. So it's a very tricky question indeed.
Well, and if I might sort of interject and add to that question, I've read recently about how France and Germany was trying to more closely follow items that were being posted online, and there was maybe like a financial consequence if you posted certain things. I can't remember what I read, and the concern was that then it would just go further underground. And then, given your difficulty in accessing data, and I know after January 6th here, some people were shifting off Facebook to places like Parler. Like, I know it's a very difficult question to answer, but like, um, I mean, after looking at how other countries are handling it, do you think that's a model for the US, or does that also present, I guess it's sort of, you've indicated it might be tricky ground?
Yeah, it's extremely tricky. I mean, I think what we have to recognize, right? And I think we're all very aware that this is a global phenomenon, and that we're going to have to come up with solutions that require us to have very serious conversations about what regulation looks like, and a commitment to bolstering democratic processes, and that's going to be challenging. I mean, it's challenging just thinking about where does China fit in all of this, and um, there's no way easy solutions. The good news is that there are people that are doing this kind of dedicated work and putting together different different ideas for ways forward. And then the question is just whether or not governments will have the will have the wherewithal to look to these scholars to to implement some of their suggestions instead of entrusting the companies to do that themselves, which is just not working.
Yeah, and you're already answering. There's another question in the chat that you've kind of already lingered into, as what might be the federal government's role in content moderation?
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely challenging, right? I mean, there have been all of these suggestions about whether or not we should, view the social media corporations as, as we have, newspapers, as regulating them in that respect, as cultural producers, and so there are a number of different ideas on the table. But it's not a simple answer, for sure. And of course, they're money making. The truth of the matter is that these are, money making machines, and countries are vested have themselves a vested interest in the economies that these platforms are bolstering. And so it's going to take it really has to be a political decision to intervene, right? It can't be just sort of left to the good graces, because we obviously see that doesn't yield anything. So
There's another question in the chat. Um, are historians, or how are historians following the increasingly difficult to identify satire that is constantly being shared on social media platforms?
yeah, it's well, I don't know so much about it. I wouldn't say historians. I mean, this is one of these great moments where historians actually benefit tremendously by working with folks in media communications and sociology. A great example would be that these folks, our colleagues, let alone the data scientists, but our colleagues that do social science really do have methods for quantifying these kinds of moments. So historians, I mean, you ask a historian sort of what their method is, and or if you have to ever write out a grant application as a historian, and you have to identify what your method is. We say things like, we go to the archive and look at sources and pull them together in some way. Whereas social science folks have a much more clear and articulate sort of sense of what they're doing. And when they're doing where they're coding, you can do sentiment analysis, you can assign meaning to words and phrases, and humor, and literally begin to kind of quantify through through the data, what you're seeing, and it does actually give a kind of a numeric power to these kind of intricate modes of communication. And so there's a lot of benefit to breaking it down even in this way and making visible things that we otherwise wouldn't necessarily see. Whether the question is more about sort of generations and taste and how younger generations use humor in a very different way. I mean, we all know too that there have been younger generations and older generations forever. And so this need to like learn the code is something that researchers have done, right, well before social media. So
Well, I know it's late there, so I'm just going to pose a few more questions too while you're still here. We have one question in the chat. Is there an unrealized potential that you would like to see realized for, quote, social media as agents of historical change, end quote?
I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer that. That's interesting. An unrealized potential for social media. I mean, I do always try to land on the side of, um, I don't want to say optimism. It's hard sometimes to be optimistic, right? But I mean, I do think that sources in and of themselves are all fraud. I mean, regardless of the subject that we're looking at, right? They're all very challenging. And I think that social media just really provides an opportunity for historians to do the work that we do very well even better, right? So it means thinking that much more clearly and that much more self-aware of how it is that we're pulling apart our sources. So we have to actually start to look at things that maybe we sometimes take for granted when we look at other sort of textual records. So social media in that respect sort of really forces us to hone our game, and I think that benefits the craft in all sorts of ways. Do I have faith that we're going to keep ahead of the
Mm.
keep ahead of the wave? I don't know. I mean, it's incredibly demoralizing what we're seeing, but I just seeing the way that my students put some of these ideas into practice gives me faith that we can effect some sort of meaningful change. But it's hard, and it's about learning all sorts of different tactics, and that's not an easy thing to do either.
I was wondering if I could interject another question and go back to a point. You made a point about people taking pictures of themselves in memorials. And this is really beyond the scope of your paper, but it made me wonder if memorials in future will be designed with an eye to that interactive exam experience. I mean, the sort of
Yeah,
beauty.
I know what you mean. It's tricky, right? I mean, there've been really there's you know s- we it's really very challenging to make the argument for selfies, right? Because we see them as we often see them as thoroughly distasteful and narcissistic, and especially in places like this, completely inappropriate. But they are also the tool and the instrument of a younger generation, armed with smartphones. It's the way it's a medium for them to understand themselves, and we may not love it, but it is, it's a cultural tool that is, of relevance and importance to giving voice to fostering a connection with the past. So I really am hesitant to completely argue against them, because they really are empowering and they actually can be incredible tools. And I think that when you already think about some of these sites, there are already mechanisms in place, whether it's the museum saying you don't need to take a selfie on the train tracks, so you don't need to, this is maybe, but the parallel would be, children don't always know how to act at funerals, right? That we, as a society, we sort of acculturate our children into sort of how to be and move through social space. And so it's not entirely different, right? We have to sort of commit as a culture to, communicating these rules and rituals in a way that allows people to proceed mindfully. And it's not really that different when it comes to, social media. It's just an extension of the social realm, right?
Mhm, absolutely. There is another question. I know you must be getting tired. But it seems related to the data you showed us at the end of your presentation. Are you seeing groups or individuals or particular communities who might be more vulnerable? Well, the question is about disinformation, but are you seeing certain communities showing up in these sites? So I don't know if you can address the question about disinformation or if your data is more on heading towards alt-right groups, but are you seeing any particular communities that seem to be identifiable?
No, and I mean, I would say that I mean, we are, the dirty little secret is that when you have data sets that big, this is just April, and just actually coding and processing the data, cleaning the data, processing the data, coding it. It actually takes a tremendous amount of time to be able to even ascertain something like that. The different hashtags that we followed also trended in different directions. So some of the hashtags trended sort of anti-Trump, and some of the hashtags pro-Trump. And so then that's another set of issues about how to actually think about the identifiers that emerge through the data. So the short answer is there's a lot to actually crunch still to be able to know anything like that. The one thing that the Facebook data showed that was really interesting, though, if I can jump from the Twitter data back to the Facebook data through the demographic tools, was that we have this, we imagine that those that are susceptible to the far right tend to be, lower middle class, uneducated, new. But the Facebook data actually showed that a lot of the people who self-identified as part of or as open to the far right were actually overwhelmingly middle class, large urban centers, so not small town disaffected folks. It actually created a very different picture of who some of these people were, and all the way down to Apple users versus Android users, and all of the silly associations we have that Apple users are progressives and that Android users are are not. So there, the data can reveal certain interesting things, but it also needs to be needs to be crunched to be able to see where that takes us.
Oh man, well, I have a million more questions I could pose to you tonight, but I think we need to let you go. Um, you've given us so much of your time and such a great presentation tonight. And I see one of my colleagues thanked you in the chat for being such a great part of our Holocaust Memorial Week this year. And I want to say that as well. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for your talk. And thanks to everyone who attended. Unless there are any more questions, I don't want to close people down, but I'm mindful of the fact that it's now almost 10:30, 11:30 for Jen, where she is. Okay. Well, thank you, Jen, so much, or Dr. Evans, so much for joining us tonight. You left us with a lot to think about, and I also have many more questions, but maybe I'll pose those to you more privately. Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who joined us. And I think we're saying goodnight now.